Has everyone settled down? Yeah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Uh, Madam Chair Masuma Hassan and the Pakistan Institute of International Affairs, many distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, friends in the media, thank you very much. Good morning and assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much for having me here at this very important convening. And well, principally I'm here because I can't say no to Masuma Hassan, and that's that. It's a very simple equation for me. But it is also a great inflection point in our life and times as the world turns quite around us. I think it's crucial that we are thinking of Bandung 70 years from it when it was initially convened. Now, I have, as I was telling a dear friend Akbar Zaidi, he said, why do you have a written speech? I said, I have only a part of a written speech because then I know I'll lapse into what I think is to be milestoned as well. But out of respect for the Institute and its president, I have done some of this delving into what Bandung means for us, and then coming into the present day. So, as we head into what could be a deeply divisive post-liberal global future, a reflection on the Bandung ideals and its impact on the moment today are important in more ways than one. The Bandung Conclave, for all of us, allowed half the world's population, I believe 54% at least, to dream of a post-colonial future, where a new global order based not just on sovereignty, but on moral purpose drove country ambitions and drove the groups forward. Pakistan was one of those nations, proudly celebrating a great coming together of what we started calling the Third World. People have forgotten that, but we grew up in something called the Third World. And today speak of as the Global South, which also emerged as a formation. As a country, we had a founding member's skin in the game, as we met in Indonesia, where our Prime Minister Muhammad Ali Bogra at that time stood with India's Sukarno, Egypt's Nasser, and yes, India's Nehru, to call for the right of developing countries to no longer be treated as pawns by great powers, which was happening, who had reshaped our borders with a callous thoughtlessness that comes only with the hubris of imperial indifference to people whose lands had been occupied and colonized. Today, it is many of the same injustices that continue to define the lived experience and serial trauma of people living in spaces called contested borders in Palestine and occupied Kashmir principally, which were created by the stroke of a pen in what I call, and I have been calling for a long time, cartographies of pain, because that is what they led to. The pain of occupied Kashmir and the pain of occupied Palestine has gone up and down in surges, in spikes of blood, sweat, and tears, and it has never abated. Today, you see where it is. Yet, it is that very Bandung spirit that had called for freedom from injustice that established a crucial space and momentum for change, that propelled and motivated a driving hope in the Charter of the United Nations, that created the non-aligned movement, and most crucially, emboldened the oppressed to speak out for the right to self-determination, for racial equality, for collective prosperity, that we need so poignantly and profoundly today. Bandung was many things to many people. To the children of the 1960s, which is my generation, who grew up looking at the granular reel of history in black and white television. We didn't have color television then, let alone smartphones or any phones in our hands. The shadows of existential wars were never quite away from our genetic memory. Even here in South Asia, despite several wars with India, and perhaps because of them, The darkness of the world wars also defined our century. There was an aversion to the costs that geopolitics, with its conflicts, deeply, imposes on billions of voiceless people. Because conflict and wars, as you know, profit only elites. They never, never profit the vulnerable who are only caused pain. It is this aversion to conflict, deeply rooted in Bandung ideals, which directed our post-colonial passions to invest both emotionally and rationally in the power of multilateralism, of common goals that would bring with it the dividends of peace and the prosperity of shared futures. These, ladies and gentlemen, were not cliches for us. They were not something that we just heard only the United Nations talking about in their brightly colored celebrations of SDGs and many other common goals that they try to bring to fruition. We honestly thought that with the agency that unity brings, and even critical mass, the dispossessed and the vulnerable could change the world. Our base reading used to be Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. So the good news then is that we did change the world. Yes, we did. Bandung helped us look at each other and not to the old imperium to reshape our destinies. So we started looking within and at least at each other as collaborators in change. Yet, the colonialism of our minds continues to some extent. We learned that women could insist on being treated as equal citizens. Somebody tell Sindh Club they belong to another century, please. We learned that territorial expansion was not the path to greatness. We understood that power came and comes from its active distribution, not in elite accumulations, and that countries only truly prosper when its poor are no longer its poor. Remember the celebration of the great middle classes and the need to work on that bulge in the middle. So all of that was what we consider important. We also learned that real power, because power is still the driving force of this century, like the last one, comes from opening majoritarian doors. A majority must not be tyrannical. It must open its doors to minorities, social, religious, and otherwise, where inclusion becomes the new normal. Societies that have opened their doors to all colors of race, gender, and ethnicity, and social inclusion have prospered very differently from societies that work in enclaves. Some just have so much abundance that the sheen of prosperity at the top sometimes cancels out the groan of what is going on at the bottom. There is darkness in many places today, but to a great extent, the world succeeded. War also became a dirty word. War was not a good thing. It became a dirty word, in my view, at least in its essence, as a force that erased valuable gains, both civilizational and humanitarian, not to mention developmental. Development gains can be wiped out by wars, which today nobody is considering in terms of costs. There is a huge cost of a carbon war, cost to war. And the carbon footprint, nobody calculates. Nobody is allowed to calculate. All the militaries in the world have seen to that. You know that, Shafkat Saab. There is no carbon calculation, even at the United Nations today, at the Framework Convention, of the carbon costs of war. And they are spectacularly high. We will talk about that later. So, we thought that war was really on its way out. And I remember reading many celebrations of how multilateralism was succeeding slowly. Conflict was no longer a path to gain. And that conflicts had simmered down in many, many countries. Now, rich countries that had extracted wealth from their colonies were also told that they had to give back. They had to give back to the South. although much of the aid infrastructure that was institutionalized at that point at the United Nations as the umbrella, as the anchor, many countries had also invested in bilateral systems and architecture that would dispense what is known as overseas development aid, for it was known as ODA, for countries that were in need, and mostly countries that had been colonized. You know, the word was not used very often, but that was the spirit. So although much of the aid infrastructure was criticized as wasteful, and rightly criticized, sometimes it took back 40 cents to the dollar or more, and it was also elite focused, despite creating a sub-economy of rents, it changed the foundation of human transactions and development. It really did. Someone should do some substantive work on this. The business of shared responsibility became the United Nations' great engine of change. And with a huge investment in erasing centuries of entrenched hegemonies against entire countries, races, genders, and faith. To this day, they try to endeavor to that end. Today, much of the brave new world, as we call it, there were many movies made and many books written, there was this catchphrase, brave new world. Really, that Bandung helped reshaped is looking tarnished, it's looking old, and unable to deliver on its promise. Not to suggest that old people and old institutions can't deliver. They often deliver much better than the younger ones. So, and I'm ageist here. As the rules that pinned neoliberalism are collapsing inside its own pathologies, the distributive or better face of multilateralism is obviously under attack. And I say pathologies because the post-war global order has not really succeeded in meeting its own stated goals for all sorts of elite protections that depended too far on systemic and structural inequality. That, make no mistake, that system also relied on a sharp pyramid of economic and other hierarchies. Yet, it was different. Its goals were different. And so while I'm not saying the old post-war order was ideal, it was very different from the world today because there was an underlying ideology of strategic global change based on protecting the global commons, on preventing wars, or at least seeking to flatten social pyramids and seek global justice in whichever form, place, or manifestation. Terrorism, of course, grew roots in 1,000 exploitations, and we can talk about that also without looking at this. But even, I do want to say that even the climate bargain that was struck under the UN Framework Conventions was based on the principle, ultimately, after Paris especially, of give back. It was. Climate colonialism had to be reversed, and much of what was agreed upon at the historic Paris conference, 2015, I think, built on that principle, that the polluter must pay. Now, but the polluter is a bit of a misnomer. It really should be emitter, because pollution is something that is local mostly. But it captures this essence of what was suggested there. Those that had historically built industrial wealth had done so by emitting toxins and heating gases, greenhouse gases, of course. Today, if their own longitude and latitude and their space from the equator, as well as their wealth, gives them the protection to build better resilience, to build guardrails against the catastrophe that climate change brings, the nations that are sinking quite literally into the sea, like the small island states, I mean, just take the Maldives, are the ones with almost no carbon footprint and almost no wealth to fight the catastrophic new era of accelerated and extremely volatile weather extremes triggered by climate stress. So this is why the term climate justice gained currency, and it was precisely the Bandung spirit that was harnessed to bring 135 countries together under the rubric of the Group of 77 plus China, again a Bandung creation, but we didn't even talk about it that way, to vote with their geopolitical rivals to flip the responsibility equation into a much higher level. And I'm proud to say that Pakistan led that. And at that point, this is only 2 years ago, even India voted with Pakistan in the chair in the spirit of seeking climate justice in their best interests at the biggest multilateral forum that runs these days, which is known as the Conference of Parties. This was in 2022 at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, when we all jointly, night after bleary night, when the conference had actually closed, and they think ministers are really tired, so they won't be there. This happened. We all stayed back, and all the South Asian countries were very much, I made them all cancel their flights and stay back, and hotel rooms had to be paid for, and found anyway, long story short, that agreement on loss and damage was wrested, literally wrested. It was like pulling teeth from the global north. We were in two groups. One huge global south, that was not Group of 77, it was called that. It was 134 countries. And everybody, every single one voted. Nobody abstained. Even the big fossil fuel energy giants of the Middle East, the titans whose economies run on fossil fuels, they also voted that these are now established principles. And for me, that was very important. The fund then, what has happened to the fund is what is what I call the gray side, the gray scale that multilateralism imposes. It's just become routinized and bureaucratized. And it, frankly, I'm sorry, it has no leadership. We had the leadership then, we were in the chair by good fortune of the G77, and we used it very effectively and very powerfully all the way from the foreign minister, which was Bilawal Bhutto Zardari then, and the prime minister, full on support. And we said, this is an opportunity. We are home, we are representing a country that was drowned, 1/3 of the country was drowned in a flood that was completely unprecedented and, frankly, triggered by climate change. And a lot of other events, climate events, are unfolding as we speak every year. One year is slightly better than the other, but the direction is certain. When emissions don't go down, which they have not, and which they are not going down, they're going this way instead of that way. And when global warming doesn't go down, which it is not, it is going literally south instead of north. I'm sorry, it's going north instead of south. Then we are in the front line. And it does need people with vision and energy to harness stakeholders, both within country and across borders, which of course, to change that, to build guardrails, to create resilience, to try to adapt, to pull people out at the right time, to invest in, alerts and early warnings. There is a whole slew of climate stress and change infrastructure that is called for in adapting to the inhuman temperatures we are facing today. And most people don't think about this. To me, it's totally existential that Pakistan went through 3 years of being the hottest place on the planet. We just don't talk about our problems. We discover Indian fishing in Balochistan, we sit on it. We don't talk about it until it's too late. We are looking at people, because that's what's going on. I'm not sitting here favoring a right-wing narrative, but that is exactly what's going on, and we'll talk about that too. But even in climate change, my God, which country goes through 53 degrees in the summer? Has anyone heard of it? Just Google it. It's Turbat, it's Dadu, and it's Jacobabad. 3 years running. Talk about it, for crying out loud. understand what it means, that this will not change on its own. Nature will not reset itself. It will need a Bandung spirit of people convening together, talking to each other, and understanding that climate change will come to their door too, with its own type of catastrophe depending on your topography, which it does. South Asia understood that, so they quietly voted with each other. But those were rational actors. That was what I call smart multilateralism, and it was literally global politics at its finest moment in recent history. It was what I call Bandung still working its magic, based entirely on the thrust of decolonizing the climate finance infrastructure that goes to developing countries, that goes to the global south. Even if loss and damage is not, it's become bureaucratized, and it's only become bureaucratized. There's no one leading the charge for the global south over there. It's just become, it's just gone into the UN system. The UN system is not designed for huge transformational change, in my view. My UN friends will contest that. They define it, but transformational change comes with serious leadership. And I have to say that the UN Secretary General, the current one, Mr. Guterres, has been one of the best leaders that the United Nations could have in times of stress, inequality, and change. He has never held back from speaking truth to many powers and continues to do so. We were very lucky to have him at the helm at that time. He visited Pakistan, as you know, and was completely responsive in his solidarity as a leader of the world's largest development forum. So the bad news then, ladies and gentlemen, is that the spirit of Bandung is getting a beating. We all know that it is. It's getting a beating with the rise of protectionisms and populisms. The rules-based order was already in ICU for a while, with Gaza and Kashmir, the poster children of its bloody and selective applications, because the rules applied for everyone else except them and many others, which I'm sure you will unpack over the day. Better minds will do that. Genocide has returned to the world, not as an act of monstrous killing on some battlefield, but as a dangerous new digital broadcast on live screens like a grisly horror telecast from a medieval arena. Please think about that. It used to be, if you've seen old films, which we all do, at least those of us, the baby boomers do, Christians versus lions in the Roman arena, so many gladiatorial films, even now Hollywood invests them. Used to be Christians versus lions, Christians 0, lions 5, stuff like that. Now it is the Palestinians versus Zion. That's exactly what's going on. This is the new bread and circus of the 21st century. And it's bloody, it's shameful, and it is not something that we should all be able to even countenance. It's entirely unconscionable, and the total dashing of the spirit that we are speaking about of Bandung. And we are now also in an era of extreme unpredictability, where despite pressing global challenges, there are clearly existential, there's structural, there's the threat of AI, which is completely, in many areas, already going quantum. It is in one place at several places at one time, which is what quantum theory is, unless the scientist in me is totally wrong, which could be the case. But there is, as the same with climate change, all over the place, at the same time, in different forms. Okay, and that's happening. We have quantum warfare, cyber warfare. It's changing with the speed we have not understood. We have not even made the rules to bind that kind of instrument or those tools. I'm not doing a little thesis here on artificial intelligence and what machines can do with their learning, or if they're better than humans or not. Right now, I'm definite that we are still on top of the human and artificial intelligence race. The machines can learn, they don't have consciousness still. But, they're working on it. They're working on it. And the world is not able to sit together to make those rules. They have not been able to make the rules for climate change. Well, they've made them and they've flouted them. But even those rules have been pushed aside, right? There is no commitment now to lowering global warming. Is that not, it's almost a surreal moment of self-harm for the human race. This is called self-sabotage, and that's what's going on. So we're not going to lower the heating because, fossil fuels work. And, well, Bandung is far behind a spirit where most people don't realize this, but there's $7 trillion going into subsidizing fossil fuels every year. You can check the IMF, they'll tell you. And so when people say there's no money to transfer to failing, debt-stricken economies who are caught in resilience, recovery, and debt traps, some countries are actually sinking. The Maldives minister tells me that they have 8 years to sink, and I said, you're just standing here being nice? That's not funny at all. Entire populations are moving from those islands. God knows where they're going. It's just called climate migration. And, our shores are also part of the sea level rise, the heating seas and all that. But I'm not making a climate speech here. There are, again, better people to do that, I see in the room. So, the space for joint solutions has just kind of disappeared, hasn't it? And that's the existential peril we face. We are standing on a brink, looking at the abyss, and the abyss is staring right back and laughing at us. Because this is a failure of collective global leadership that actually doesn't pinpoint anyone, it doesn't create responsibility, but responsibility has to be taken. And it also has to be asked for, to be taken. As any woman will tell you, you don't get your rights served up on a platter by a nice UN. Even there, you have to be not the nice woman and the graceful woman. You have to ask, demand, and push. The thing that I hate, the pushy person, but you have to. That's the only way. So, bringing that back, we have to see what are the highest investments in conflict and warfare. Where are we going? Since World War II, the planet has never seen this number of active conflicts since World War II. So, with all that commitment to peace and joint solutions and multilateralism, where have we gone? Strategically drifted straight into the largest number of conflicts the world has ever seen. Is this where we were supposed to be in the 21st century? We were supposed to be solving hunger, looking at famines, the erosions of our food systems and our water insecurities as they rise. And we were supposed to use AI to power that change. And right now we're doing none of that because we're sitting in our silos and we have invested in the hardest boundaries in the world. You have to invest in boundaries when your country is under attack. That's a no-brainer. You can't stand there hand-wringing and say, I'll think about it. It says, no, you're going to hit me, I'm going to hit you right back. That's called deterrence in English. So, the world has drifted into that. The humanitarian crises that these wars and conflicts have unleashed get as much space in the global media as the vulnerable do. So, but from Palestine to Europe, and actually Darfur in Africa, which is the largest humanitarian disaster and conflict going on. No one talks about that, but that's going on. And between trade wars and simmering wars, real wars such as in the Indo-Pacific, as well as Strait of Hormuz, you have, then you have the Red Sea, all of that. we have tensions escalating in hotspots everywhere in the world. There are many hotspots being looked at in a map of potential rising strategic conflict that can implode. So, one of these conflicts is on everyone's minds because one of them is very much on our minds because it relates to India and Pakistan. And this has happened in the last week. I remember when we spoke about this conference, none of that was on the table. So that's where I stopped the written speech, if I may. And I believe this particular crisis is fueled almost entirely by the lure of fundamentalism. It's domestic gains that are made in politics and very narrow, short-term, myopic politics, and the serial inclusions that Narendra Modi has taken India into. He's made it a whole different world. Which is not to say that it was some kind of, it stood out as a beacon of inclusion and spectacular secular virtues. It did not. We all know about that everybody here is a seasoned interlocutor. But the goals were different. The stated goals were different. When stated goals also shift, which is why I keep talking about actually what is said, when your stated goals shift, then it's each woman or man for themselves or child, right? Then there's no law on the table. When stated goals drop, then there's no. So that's what's going on. Challenges, I mean, they talked about terrorism or climate stress, should now have offered entry points into problem solving together. India has a huge water basin under extreme stress. It's not just ours. Their river systems, but their basins are polluted and their rivers extreme stress. You know about Delhi and Lahore competing with each other to be the most polluted cities in the world. It's not a ranking anyone should be happy about, but that's the reality. And while we're thinking of how to work some smog lowering, how to think of, improving water practices on the basin is shared. Climate change, AI, terrorism, pandemics, all of these challenges don't appreciate borders. Right now, I'm very grateful for my border, thank you very much. I'm not going to be one-sided, but the point here is that that was not the future that was optimal for the survival, well-being, and prosperity of this century. This century was supposed to be another kind of century. And instead, it's become one of serial trauma witnessed on our screens, existential climate crisis, and unchecked conflicts with no one really to suggest that these don't work. Because if a state attacks another state, either in words or a precision strike, as India is calling the abeyance of the Indus Waters Treaty, then you have to make a precision strike back, because please don't assume that they're Mother Teresa handing out cookies and Band-Aids. That's not the person you're speaking to. You're speaking to a militarized, shall we say, conclave of decision makers, a policy elite that is understanding, that seeks power, that seeks to even say and suggest that Pakistan is not really, we should not be really thinking of Pakistan as a country. I mean, the people we have been speaking to as peacemakers stood up and said a few days ago that, oh, we took care of East Pakistan, and now let's do the same to Pakistan. Which is why I made a bit of a hard speech in the Senate yesterday addressing this, and I'm also having to say this too. States know and must defend their borders. While we have been seeking the melting away of those and working across those, if someone is not working with you then you have to defend what you have. That is the first responsibility of governments and states, to provide law, order, and protection for its people. It's not an anti-liberal fantasy. That is what is done. But when that goes away, we should have been working on risk reduction regimes. We should have been working on how to climb down from a potential escalation in crisis. We are two nuclear countries, neighbors. There is no such other situation, which have been serially at war with a huge trust deficit and unable now to even talk on crisis reductions telephones and channels. That is unheard of. And the spectacular overconfidence that the world has in that things won't spiral out of control is also very worrying, because it's just been allowed to drift this way, because India wishes to invest in aggression. So it's been allowed to go that way. That is not a good path that will end well for either the aggressor or those that is being aggressed upon. So when you're seeking to deliver costs on Pakistan of war, you will deliver equally or more high costs on your own country. This is what I'm trying to say. But I am not sure at all, Madam Chair, that India is operating from a space of rational decision-making at this point. Or is rational in foreign policy no longer really rational? It is just the articulation of how best to create countries that are war machines, because that's what old empires used to be, even Muslim ones. They were effective, smart, coordinated war machines. Are we going back to that era? Are we to all become war? Because that is where India is taking the world, the region. The South Asian region has 1/5 of humanity living here. India has more poorer people, more farmers committing suicide, more land starved, more land hunger, more water insecurity than Pakistan. They do, because they have more of everything. I don't mean percentages, but right now, people can't be in conflicts. We cannot see people as statistics. We have got to stop seeing people as statistics. That's what numbers sometimes do. Look at what conflict is doing to people. Look at the absence, what the absence of war can do, where peace and normalization can take you. There are whole books and papers and thought leadership available on that. I had invested in that level of thought process, that peace would bring its dividends, that we must push for it, even if it's trade, even if it's cultural exchanges, the great post-colonial vanishing of our histories can't disappear. But that's what's going on right now. Road names are being changed. I mean, how much can you erase? The history's erasure is underway. And so is Bandung's erasure. The spirit of Bandung is under severe stress. And it's not just so in India, where they have created a very shrill echo chamber that we are all then compelled to respond to, because if you don't, then unlike human relations, if you abuse me, I'm just going to turn away and not sink to that level. But if states don't respond proportionately and equally sometimes, then they are considered weak and therefore open to attack. I'm sorry to be saying this, but that is the harsh reality of how a strategic calculus works. And it is something you all need to think about, especially with global apartheids and inequalities rising. More and more people are going into poverty all over the world. More and more people are across the tech apartheid. There's 2.7 billion, mostly in the global south, who are excluded from education, from health, from opportunity. Many are in South Asia. And they needed those opportunities, they needed better futures. And as you all know, girl children are the most excluded. When there's food on the table and there is not enough food on the table, the slicing of the pie is for the girl child. Well, there's not enough money to send anyone to school, 3 children to school, the girls are held back. So it's the weakest in every chain that suffers. As I said, conflict is for only profits, power, and powerful elites, whereas real power comes from harnessing the power of people. I don't say that because I'm a politician, but that really is the case. If you look at countries with some level of, development linked to happiness, okay, so that does matter. So with these words, I'm going to say that, when you have, that there are many failures. Neoliberalism has failed in many ways. The 1% continues to hold at least 50% of the world's wealth, and the arguments in the end are about wealth. It's really about wealth and power. The pursuit of those at the exclusion of more and more people is what we need to work against. That is the whole point of regenerating and reinvigorating something like the Bandung spirit, where clarity was, I don't think it was really needed. Clarity was very openly amplified, that we are post-colonial societies, we are still working with some different levels of structural injustice. I mean, I know we must help ourselves. I'm the first to say that. Take responsibility for your state of affairs. That all goes without saying. It should go without saying. But then there is the levels of debt, the levels of climate injustice, the level of structural exclusions that countries like ours are facing. We will have to live now in a world of mini-lateralisms and find, navigate different blocks. There will be great superpower competition as you continue to witness it. And Pakistan can actually seek opportunity in this challenge. The whole point of resilience is finding opportunity in challenge. I mean, hope and hope needs a plan. So we need to give our people those plans, that we are investing in our future, and investments in the future have to be, I've been shouting this unglamorous message for the last 5 years, it has to be in your food and water security. It has to start there. I mean, because we don't need food or water, and this hotel is already in my blacklist for promoting plastics, which don't ever degrade for 1,000 years. If anyone's told you otherwise, you can come to me. I will disabuse you scientifically of that. They go into your food. And so half of Islamabad has been terrified into letting go of unrecyclable plastics. There is no such thing as recycling. It doesn't happen. Only 9% of plastics in the world are recycled. Only 9%. So please, do a little act of protest. Let's relate our lives to what we say. Just a little act of change, of coming out of our comfort zones, will put us back in a better place. Don't strip ourselves of agency. We still have agency over our lives. And let's invest in that kind of spirit. To me, that is what Bandung meant. I'm sure it meant other things to other people. But when we're in a meeting, that meeting must speak to some of your ideals, at least 10% of them. That's all I'm saying. And I just want to now thank you. I'm sure I didn't fulfill a lot of expectations here on the strategic path ahead. It's very clear to me the strategic path ahead is always to seek de-escalation in any conflict, because conflict is it's toxic. It's toxic to the human race. But if the other is not de-escalating and translates it as weakness, please learn to protect yourself and understand that. Thank you very much.